Good morning, Mr. Canavan.
Good morning, Sir Brian.
Well, you can hear me. You can see me, I hope.
Yes.
Good.
Clearly.
Can I start with an apology for the time you've been kept waiting this morning? We'd hoped to start at 10, as we always do, or almost always do, but there were some logistical issues to be sorted out first. We're now ready to begin. Let me explain the arrangements here. You're talking to a small audience here in Aldwych House, both in the hearing room and in a breakout room beyond. There are a number of lawyers and some representatives of the press, but your bigger audience will come online, either by live stream or YouTube. So that's the number of people who are watching what you have to say. The questions will be asked in a moment or two by Miss Richards once you have been sworn, and Mary will ask you to take the affirmation in a moment. You are, I think, at home, and that's what I've been told. That's right, is it?
Yes, it is, yes.
And you are there in the House, are representatives or a representative of the Government Legal Department, and the technicians are on hand in case of any problem. But you do understand that at any break, because you'll be under questioning and under oath, you are not permitted to talk to anyone about the evidence you have given or anything you think you may yet be asked to give. Anyone, whoever they are, but you can talk about anything else you like.
Understood.
Mary.
Please state your full name.
John Canavan.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Mr. Canavan, can you see and hear me?
Mary.
Yes, thank you.
I'm going to start with an overview of your career. You were a civil servant from 1966 to your retirement in November 2002. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you joined the Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance originally in 1966, which then became the Ministry of Social Security and then merged to become the Department of Health and Social Security.
Correct.
And most of your career as a civil servant was spent with the Department of Health.
It was, yes.
In summary of your career, you worked between 1966 and 1971 in national insurance offices, is that right?
That's right, yes.
And then for a short period, 1971 to September 1972, you worked in the medicines division, doing preliminary checks on applications for licences, is that right?
Yes.
And then you continued within, I think, the medicines division of the DHSS through to 1978, working in the branch responsible for pharmaceutical price regulation.
Well, no, I had left the medicines division when I got promoted and transferred to working on pharmaceutical price regulation. That was part of the supply division at that time.
Thank you. And then between late 1978 and late 1979 or early 1980, you worked in the branch that negotiated pay and conditions for professions auxiliary to medicine.
Yes.
You then moved to the department's management services branch between 1980 and 1983, is that right?
Yes.
And then 1983 to 1988, you were section head for policy in relation to high street optical services.
Yes.
And then it was in January 1989 that you took up the role which is of interest to the inquiry. You worked, first of all, between January 1989 and December 1991 in the branch known as Health Services 1A, HS1A.
Yes,
And you were a principal at that point, and you took over from Dr. Roger Moore, who the inquiry has already heard from.
I did.
In terms of your areas of responsibility in that role, if we could have on screen, please, Lawrence, WITN 71150002. And if we can just, thank you. So this is a document, it's got the section HS1A, it's got your name, John Canavan, and then as I understand it, it has your areas of responsibility: National Blood Transfusion Service, supply of blood and blood products, Central Blood Laboratories Authority, administration of Radioactive Substances Advisory Committee, Nuclear Medicine, Pharmaceutical Services, Hospital Aspects, Clinical Pharmacology, Haemophilia/Macfarlane Trust, and AIDS litigation. So is that an accurate description of your responsibilities at that time?
Yes,
And we can see that there are 6 support staff identified, and then there's a reference to professional support, and we have 4 people listed, including Dr. Raymond, from whom the inquiry has already heard. These were members of the medical side of the department at that time, is that right?
that's right. We had a parallel organisation at that time, medical and administrative.
I'll come back to ask you a little more about the way in which the parallel structure worked in due course. We can take that down, thank you. You tell us in your witness statement that in terms of the professional or medical side, you worked most closely with Dr. Raymond, is that right?
Yes,
And then in terms of your own reporting structure, you reported to the Assistant Secretary, who was initially Malcolm Harris and then Charles Dobson, is that correct?
that's correct.
And then you tell us in your statement that HS1 was a branch within a bigger HS division that was headed by an Under-Secretary who reported to a Deputy Secretary who at that time was Strawn Heppel.
Yes,
And then Mr. Heppel would report to the Permanent Secretary, who was first of all Christopher France and then Graham Hart.
yes,
Now, in January 1992, following a departmental organisation, the branch became HCA4, but is it right to understand that your role and responsibilities didn't alter?
yes. Throughout all these name changes, my responsibilities remained the same.
You, however, now reported to Roger Schofield.
Roger Schofield, yes.
And then June 1992 to March 1994, following another reorganisation or name change, the branch within which you worked became known as CAOPU2. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
And you continued to report to Mr. Schofield?
I did, yes.
Now that takes us up to March 1994, and so my questions will relate essentially to the period from January 1989 to March 1994. But just so that we complete the rest of your career, if we go to your witness statement, WITN 71150001. And we go to page 14. We can see, I think, from the bottom half of the page, you tell us, first of all, in paragraph 115, that you left the role that we've just been discussing at the end of March 1994. You then went on secondment to the NHS Ombudsman for approximately a year and a half. You then joined the Health Promotion Division, where you worked between 1995 and 1999. And then if we go to the next page, you worked for a short period of time, 2000 to 2001, in branch SCT, dealing with matters relating to social care. And then your last period at the Department of Health was back dealing with high street optical services. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
We can take that down, thank you. Now, you also tell us in your statement that during your time at the Department of Health, you were involved with a range of different committees and working groups. The most relevant for the inquiry's purposes is your work with the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, and I'll come on to that in a few minutes and ask you some more questions about it. But I just wanted to ask you first of all about the Advisory Group on Hepatitis. Now that's, as I understand it, a group that you became involved with in the second half of the 1990s, is that right?
Yes, I mean, I don't remember much involvement at all while I was on the blood policy seat. It was later on when I was in HP, after having come back from the department, that I was listed as being a member of the Secretariat.
And just so that we can get an understanding of what this group was, if we can have on screen, Lawrence, DHSC 0006281_127. This is a document from 1997, and we can see it's from a Mr. Robb in HP 3B, so the Health Promotion Branch where you'd moved to. Not a document copied, I'm not sure whether it's copied to you. Yes, it was copied to you. We can see that from page 4. We don't need to go to it. But in any event, this is looking at the Advisory Group on Hepatitis in 1997. But if we go to paragraph 4, please, Lawrence. We can see it says there that the AGH was set up in 1980 with the remit to provide medical advice to the chief medical officers of the health departments of the United Kingdom on all aspects of communicable hepatitis. And then it explains a few lines further down, the Secretariat is provided by HP3 officials.
Yes.
If we go over the page, just wanted to ask you about something in paragraph 7. Under the heading Views of AGH, so reviews of the Advisory Group on Hepatitis. At his request, Professor Banat-Vala, who was the chair, met with the CMO in September 1996 to express the group's concerns about the AGH's role. The group was concerned that the AGH's advice was not reaching TOTO. I think that stands for top of the office, is that right?
It does, yes.
And ministers, and being acted upon quickly enough, he envisaged a more high-profile role for the group. The AGH's views are a further indication that it would be timely to carry out a view. Now, obviously, this is looking at the position as at 1996, 1997. Do you have any recollection of this particular group, the AGH, having any role during the time you were dealing with blood and blood products and blood policy?
No.
And is it your understanding that the reason for that is because by the time you took up your job, or at the time you took up your job, the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood was being established?
That's right, and it was advising on broader policy concerns, whereas the AGH was really more about medical and scientific concerns and advising the CMO.
Do you have any knowledge of whether, prior to the establishment of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood at the beginning of 1989, whether this group, the advisory group on hepatitis had anything to do with looking at transmission of hepatitis by blood or blood products?
I don't know.
Could we then go to, before we leave this group, the document of MHRA 0025293, please? And if we could go, I think it's to page, well, if we just look at what this is, it's a minute from Dr. Raymond to Mr. Powell. It's in the course of the HIV haemophilia litigation, and it's discussing an expert report that had been received from a Dr. Williams. I just wanted to ask you about something that's on page 3. So if we can go to page 3, please. We can see this is described as a note on meeting between counsel and Dr. Roger Williams on the 5th of June 1990, and then there's a number of comments said to have been made by Dr. Williams. If we just go to the bottom of the page. Paragraph 8 reads, Dr. Williams suggested checking minutes of the Hepatitis Advisory Board held in DHSS and of which he was a member. And then in brackets, it said, I've checked this out with administrators who believe that all these minutes have been destroyed. Now, as I understand your statement, Mr. Canavan, you're not aware of anything called the Hepatitis Advisory Board, is that right?
That's right. I think in my witness statement I said the advisory group on hepatitis.
And so if this was, and if this was a reference to the advisory group on hepatitis, it would appear to be said here that the minutes of that group, at least prior to this point in time, had been destroyed. Do you have any knowledge of whether minutes of the advisory group on hepatitis in the 1980s were destroyed, and if so, in what circumstances?
No, I don't know.
We can take that down. Thank you, Lawrence. I'm just going to ask you, before we look in more detail at the ACVSB, some general questions about your role and your work. Very roughly, in the period 1989 to 1994, how much of your time was spent dealing with issues relating to blood and blood products, as opposed to the other responsibilities that you had?
Oh, looking back at it, given the litigation was on the go and the frequency of ACVSB meetings, I would say 80%, maybe more than that. From time to time, it would be only these other aspects that would be getting much attention.
And when you joined HS1 in January 1989, did you receive any training or instruction or information about blood products, blood policy?
No, it was a case of picking it up from the files as and when the need arose.
Do you recall what, if anything, you knew at that time, so January 1989, about the circumstances in which people had been infected with HIV or hepatitis through blood and blood products?
No, I came to it as a novice.
Can you tell us a little more about the parallel structure, so the medical and the administrative side? How did that work?
Well, each side had its own reporting lines. The administrative side eventually went up to the permanent secretary, and the medical side went up to the CMO. If it was working well, then the two sides, if your opposite number on the medical side would have overlapping responsibilities with your own as an administrator. And that was very much the case with Dr. Raymond as a haematologist in relation to blood.
Were you based in the same physical location, the same office area?
We were in the same office building, yes.
And we often see from the documents being copied to or sent to both you and Dr. Raymond, with both of you often commenting on the same issues or the same material, set of submissions, whatever it might be. Again, was that how it was intended to work as far as you understood it?
Yes, because I would cover maybe the administrative stroke policy side, and Dr. Raymond would cover the medical stroke scientific side.
You explained in your statement that you yourself had no medical or scientific background or qualification. In practice, did that mean that you, for medical advice, clinical input, you would be heavily reliant upon your medical colleagues, whether it was Dr. Raymond or anyone else?
Indeed, I would have only had a layman's understanding of those subjects.
And to what extent would you or your administrative colleagues feel able to challenge or test or probe what was being said to you by medical colleagues about clinical matters?
We felt free. It was, if we didn't understand something or didn't understand the logic behind it, we would question it.
Now, in terms of the hierarchy within the administrative side of the Department of Health, how easy or difficult was it for a more junior civil servant to challenge or test or probe what was being said by a more senior civil servant?
I think that if you had good grounds for doing so, then the more senior officer would respect what you were saying.
Was it something that was encouraged, or did it very much depend upon the personalities of the individuals?
There was no hierarchical disincentive to doing it, but obviously the personalities would influence how easily it might be done or not.
To what extent did you have direct dealings yourself during your time dealing with blood policy with the Deputy Secretary or Permanent Secretary?
Quite a bit, particularly over the McFarlane Trust in its various guises. And I had, yes, on both the McFarlane Trust original version and the 1 and the 2, which made the special £20,000 payment, and then the one which paid out the litigation settlement.
And what was the extent of your interaction with ministers?
It was on an as needed basis. If they wanted to follow up a submission with a meeting, then they would ask for one. And I would go along to give whatever further explanation they were looking for.
And
later on in the litigation, it went up the hierarchy a bit as to who attended meetings.
You told us you didn't receive any particular training or instruction when you joined on matters relating to blood policy, and it was a question, I'm paraphrasing your answer, but of learning on the job and looking in the files to see the existing material. How would you learn then what the existing policies were or existing lines to take were? Was it a question of looking back at the most recent file and seeing what was on there?
Yes, I mean, the civil service trades heavily on always consulting the back record to see what had been said beforehand. And you either then carried it forward or adapted it or amended it as the current circumstances allowed or required.
And to what extent would someone in your position be able to scrutinise existing policies, existing lines to take, to see if they were in truth well-founded, or to see whether they were still appropriate?
I mean, in terms of appropriateness, you would have checked back enough to see if that was still the policy line coming from ministers. If it was, then it could be used. If not, then it had to be brought into line with the ministerial thinking.
And were there any particular criteria for deciding when something needed to go to ministers?
No criteria. It was more a case of how important the issue was and whether it was having wider ramifications across the department.
Now, from time to time, you were prepared or were involved in the preparation of briefings or submissions to ministers. Was it your understanding that ministerial decisions would often be taken largely or solely on the basis of what was set out in the submission or briefing?
I think that varied. I mean, ministers were free to take a contrary line if they wished, and sometimes did. And I think you probably have seen there was a submission went up that had no single line to take from the department as such. So, as I say, it varied, but whether there was any pushback, it depended on the minister. As I say, they were free to push back if they wished, or as I say, more often what would happen would be they would ask for a meeting for further explanation to see if they were content or not content.
But in terms of the information that was available to ministers, and obviously ministers, depending upon the particular issue, might have had communications with colleagues or with the Chief Medical Officer or in Parliament. But if civil servants are preparing a briefing or submission for ministers to enable ministers to take a decision, was the approach that to try and put everything in the submission that the civil servants judged the minister needed in order to take the decision?
That's why drafts, generally speaking, were circulated to the various branches that had an interest so that they could input to it.
In your statement, you've talked on a couple of occasions of a difference between something expressing your personal views and something which is conveying a policy view from the department. And you've told us in your statement that when views were being expressed in briefings, submissions and so on, they would be representing for the most part a policy view from the department, not your own personal views.
Yes, that's correct.
How would you go about ascertaining what the policy view of the department was on a topic?
Well, as I say, we had access to the files within our own branch, and by circulating to other branches which may have had a bearing on policy, we would get their input to the submission.
Can I then just ask, again, a general question, but on a slightly different topic, what the nature and extent of your interactions or dealings was with colleagues in Scotland, in the Scottish Home and Health Department? Did you have much interaction with them during your time dealing with blood policy?
in particular around the litigation, both sides were intent in trying to keep in step insofar as the different legal systems would allow. And there were a number of exchanges to try and secure that. As a matter of course, in Department of Health, because we had the territorial interest, we generally had a habit of copying papers to our Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland colleagues so that they could keep abreast of what was on the go.
And was there a sense, if we leave aside the HIV litigation, but more generally, was there a sense that the Department of Health in London took the lead on major policy developments?
Yes.
And in terms of interactions with civil servants or health officials in Wales and in Northern Ireland, was that again a question of copying colleagues in when there were major issues, or were there any kind of more regular interactions?
No, it was normally major issues that were copied into them.
And I'll come back to that when we look at the ACVSB and the role of the observers. Did you, during the course of your time dealing with blood policy, meet with haemophilia centre directors or regional transfusion directors, other than through membership of committees such as the ACVSB?
No.
You had interaction with the Macfarlane Trust, and I'll come back to that to a limited extent later on. What about the Haemophilia Society? Did you have much by way of regular interaction with the Haemophilia Society?
I saw their secretary from time to time.
And that would be Mr. Waters?
Yeah, that's right, yes, David Waters.
And was that largely in connection with issues relating to the litigation and the Macfarlane Trust payments, or was there a more general relationship with the Haemophilia Society?
I think it was more general. I think we were both observing that we were on different sides of the issues around litigation.
Now, you've told us how, in order to ascertain what existing policy was, existing lines to take were, you would need to look back at the files to see what was on the files. That would suggest that it was particularly important for files to be well maintained and for them to contain a comprehensive account of decision-making on particular issues. Would that be fair as a general statement?
Yes.
Do you recall what, if any, training you received during your civil service career generally, or in particular around this time, 89 to 94, on record keeping and records management?
No, I had worked in several branches of DH, and by then I think I had assimilated the message that files have to be kept and reviewed after a certain time if they've been dispatched to storage, and that some files, they didn't have any ongoing relevance. Policy files certainly did, and they were kept for longer before destruction.
And do you recall who the branch reviewing officer was in the period that you were dealing with blood policy?
No, it was more that it was done at a particular grade.
What was your understanding of what needed to be recorded in writing and put on a file? So we've seen plenty of examples of ministerial submissions or of exchanges between colleagues within the department. But if there were meetings, for example, Was there an expectation that all meetings would be minuted, or did it depend on the nature of the meeting?
If it was an informal meeting, maybe not. If it was a more formal meeting around a matter of substance, then that would be minuted as a matter of course and put on the file.
And was there any general practice as to whose responsibility it was to minute such meetings? Was it the responsibility of the most junior person there, or did it depend?
It would depend, but generally speaking, the most junior from whichever section or branch had convened the meeting would do it.
We saw from the document we looked at a little while ago that you had a number of support staff as well as the medical colleagues. Did you feel that the blood policy team, or the particular team that you were principal for, was sufficiently resourced in the period 1989 to 1994?
It was hard worked, but with the use of temporary staff around the discovery of documents, we probably could do what we had to do.
Was there much time for reflection on policy, thinking about whether fresh perspectives needed to be brought to bear, or was it very much a question of having to be reactive because there were such demands on your time?
I would say that's a fairer description, yes.
So it's the latter, the more reactive, because it was busy.
Yes.
And then just one final general question before we look at the ACVSB. I asked you about dealings with ministers, submissions to ministers, and you observed that ministers could ask for more information, could ask questions, and so on. Did you get any sense during the time you were dealing with blood policy matters 89 to 94 of the extent to which ministers would, or the ministers you were coming into contact with, would challenge what they were being told, or would ask more questions? Or did it very much depend upon the issue and the particular minister?
Depend on the issue, but one I recall was Tom Sackville asked for a meeting on anti-HBC screening when the advice was not to proceed with testing. He asked for a meeting to explore the issue further. That's one example I can remember.
Now, I'm going to move then to the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. We've explored the work of that committee, in particular in the period 1989 to 1991, with a number of other witnesses, Mr. Canavan. So I'm not going to take you through each and every document and look at each set of minutes and explore the details of the decision-making at every stage. I'm going to try and focus on your own involvement and some of the documents the inquiry hasn't looked at in its hearings yet, so some of the communications that were taking place internally within the department. But if we start with a document about the establishment of the ACVSB, so WITN 4486049, please, Lawrence. We can see here a letter dated the 8th of March 1989. This is an invitation to Dr. Gunson to participate in the advisory committee. If we just go down the page, we can see it. This is from Dr. Harris, who at that stage was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. And as I understand it, Mr. Canavan, Dr. Harris chaired the ACVSB for the first one or two meetings, and then his successor was Dr. Metters.
That's correct.
And you've got quite a good recollection of Dr. Metters, but not very much recollection of Dr. Harris.
Not much of Dr. Harris. I was fairly new to the scene. And basically, apart from the 3-year, 2 or 3 meetings that he attended, I had really no dealings with him.
And then we can just see the terms of reference, if we just go up to the text of the letter again, to advise the health departments of the UK on measures to ensure the virological safety of blood whilst maintaining adequate supplies of appropriate quality for both immediate use and for plasma processing. Now, as I understand it from the documents and from your statement, Mr. Canavan, the decision to set up the ACVSB and in broad terms the question of who to invite to be members of the ACVSB were decisions that had already been taken or were already ongoing by the time you joined the department or joined this branch.
Right.
But did you, through your subsequent work with the ACVSB, ever gain any understanding as to why there hadn't been a national committee on the virological safety of blood before this?
Not really, no. Apart from what's in the various submissions setting up this committee, it seemed to be that it identified that there were issues which required a cross-disciplinary input, and the ACVSB was a means of obtaining that.
And if we go to page 4 of this document, there is a paper ACVSB 1/1, so it's a paper number 1 for the first meeting of the ACVSB. It's got terms of reference at the top, and then we have Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. We have the terms of reference set out again, and then this note remit is UK-wide. Our concern is matters of major policy, not the detailed implementation of policy. Did you have any clear understanding, either at the time or now, on that distinction, the distinction between a matter of major policy and the detailed implementation of policy?
Yes, the National Blood Transfusion Service, under its directorate, were the people concerned with implementation. The department was concerned with policy, but not rolling it out on the ground.
And then in terms of the remit being UK-wide, we see from the minutes that there were representatives from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland invited to attend the meetings effectively as observers. What was your understanding of their role?
Well, that was to keep in touch with what was going on and to keep their departments in touch with what was going on.
And would... sorry, carry on.
No, as I say, I think that was it, yes.
And would all the papers that were put together for each ACVSB meeting, would those be also sent to the observers from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland?
Yes.
And we know that the meetings were confidential, and Dr. Metters would often emphasise the confidentiality of the meetings to those attending. But in terms of the observers from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, was it your understanding that they were free to share what the ACVSB was doing with their own departments?
With their own department, certainly, yes.
Just while we've got this document on screen, if we go to page 6, there's a document entitled Overview of Problems for this committee, and it's paper ACVSB 1/2. And then we've got a list of subjects. I don't propose to read through them all, but if we just go to the bottom of this page, we see the reference to non-A, non-B. The issue of surrogate or direct testing for non-A, non-B hepatitis is also of some urgency. It is suggested this could be a major item for the next meeting, even though a final decision may have to await UK research currently in progress. Now, it might be said this is expressing a judgment in terms of the degree of urgency of this issue, and it's not being put on the agenda for the first meeting. Do you know who produced this, or whose assessment of the relative importance of surrogate or direct testing this is. Is this Dr. Harris expressing his view?
I'm sorry, I really don't know who prepared that paper.
Now, we can take that down, thank you. You were part of the secretariat to the ACVSB, as was Dr. Raymond. What was your understanding of your role and indeed of that of your colleague, Dr. Raymond?
Well, I mean, we had to ensure the smooth running of the committee and make sure it was properly minuted, that follow-up action was initiated, and in the case of Dr. Raymond, where the chairman might commission him to do a background or other paper, he would do that.
During the committee's discussions at its meetings, to what extent did you participate in the discussions or express views on the matters being discussed?
Only insofar as it involved the running of the committee or the circulation of papers, not in the substance of the scientific or medical debate that was being had round the table.
What about Dr. Raymond and Dr. Pickles, who also attended as an observer at a number of these meetings? To what extent do you recall either of them participating in the substance of the discussions?
Yes, they had the professional background to participate, but I can't remember to what extent they did chip in.
And then the observers, the other observers, so the observers from the Welsh office from Northern Ireland, from the Scottish Home and Health Department, were they very much silent, passive observers, or were there opportunities for them to express views during the course of the committee's meetings?
If I recall correctly, they were all professionally qualified, and therefore, as with Dr. Raymond and Dr. Pickles, could chip in to the discussions.
So would it be right to understand that in terms of the ability to contribute, from your perspective, it was not so much the capacity in which someone attended, observer, secretariat, but the extent to which they had professional, clinical, scientific background and therefore potentially a knowledge of the issues being discussed?
Yes.
Can we then look at a document, a chairman's brief, DHSC 0002494_023? So this is a document entitled Chairman's Brief. This is for the meeting on the 4th of April 1989, so the first meeting of the ACVSB. There's reference to introductions and the like. If we go down to the bottom half of the page, we've got the reference there to the terms of reference, and it's suggested that members' attention could be drawn to a number of points. The first of which is remit is UK-wide, and committee will formally report to the CMOs. What was your understanding of how the reporting would work, and who would see the product of the committee's deliberations? And this would seem to suggest that the minutes would go to the CMOs. Would it then be the responsibility of CMOs to advise their ministers, or was there a different way of dealing with it?
The committee minutes would have gone first of all to the chairman, who was also a deputy chairman, a deputy chief medical officer, and he would involve the CMO and also direct us when he felt that maybe we had to go to ministers. But either of those officials could go to ministers of their own volition.
And is it right to understand that the minutes themselves didn't go to ministers?
Generally speaking, no. I can't remember a case when they would have done. The submission would have taken the substance of what was said.
If we go over the page, there's an overview of problems and plan of work. I don't need to go through the detail of that, and we've seen a similar document already. Who would produce the chairman's brief? Was this part of your responsibility?
Part of my responsibility, but in collaboration with Dr. Raymond.
And what was the purpose of it?
Really just to prime the chairman with what issues were going to be discussed, who might lead off introducing papers which had been produced for the committee, and really just priming him about whatever the domestic arrangements were for the meeting.
And then if we just go to page 5 of this document, there's a background note. If we can just have the whole page up again, Lawrence. We can see it's got your details at the bottom, although someone has then crossed those through. I think I'm right in saying in your statement I think it's entirely possible that you produced this, although you can't particularly remember it.
I can't remember it, but it's entirely possible, yes.
And we can see just in the first paragraph, it says, historically, the blood transfusion services have adopted new screening procedures in an ad hoc fashion in response to advances in clinical knowledge. In some cases, the advice of specially constituted expert groups have been sought, as with hepatitis and AIDS. And then it continues, concern to maintain the safety of the blood supply has been heightened by greater public and clinical awareness of the potential for viral contamination and the developments in product liability legislation. And then there's reference to the need for a range of disciplines. And then the last sentence says, hence the need for this new advisory committee on which all the interests are represented, but which can also take an overview. Now, that note, but in particular the first paragraph, might tend to suggest that the Department of Health had viewed the way in which screening decisions had been taken in the past and thought there was scope for improvement in terms of how those decisions could be taken. I'm conscious that would have been before you joined this particular branch, but do you have any recollection or understanding or thoughts as to where you might have got what you've set out in that first paragraph?
No, but in a sense, the ACVSB was an answer to that first paragraph. And it probably owed its origin to what's described there.
We can take that down, thank you. One view that's been expressed to the inquiry in the course of the evidence it's heard is that, at least viewed with the benefit of hindsight, there was insufficient public health expertise on the committee, and that matters were perhaps viewed with too much through the views of virologists and others. Do you recall any discussion about the membership of the committee, and in particular whether it should be widened to bring on board greater public health expertise?
Not at any meetings that I attended, no.
You've said in your statement, if we go to WITN 7115001, I think it's page 21. Yes, if we pick it up at the top of the page, in the second line, you say the committee gave independent advice on whether it was appropriate and at what stage it was appropriate to introduce testing. And I just wanted to ask you a little more about that idea of its advice being independent. Independent of whom? Of the Department of Health?
Yes, it was based on their best professional advice of the members.
There was, however, a close relationship between the ACVSB and the Department of Health, not least, obviously, the role of Dr. Harris and then Dr. Metters as DCMO within the department, but also chair. To what extent did you feel the committee was truly independent of the Department of Health?
From recollection, Dr. Metters was a very good chairman who made sure that the members had every opportunity to have their say. And again, from seeing the documents, he did a very good job of summing up their views. So to that extent, their independent advice was available to the department without the department having in any way attempted to meddle with it.
And it's right to understand that the committee's role was, as you say there, to give advice, so it might make recommendations, but it was not a decision-making committee. Was that your understanding?
That's right. Decisions would rest with ministers.
And then in terms of financial implications and costs, to what extent was consideration of those matters part of the committee's job?
Well, it wasn't formally part of their remit at all. I mean, where it talks about having to ensure continued supply of blood and plasma, that could be seen as a cost consequence of their decision making if there was any problem about maintaining donor numbers. But in terms of costs, they couldn't be blind to cost consequences, but that was something where the department would then have its input into cost and cost benefit.
If we then just go further down this page to paragraph 2.9, where you talk about Dr. Metters, you've described him there as a heavyweight character. What did you mean by that?
I mean, I think he was well respected around the department, and of course, he was of a grade where he would have influence.
And you say also that he was also politically astute and alive to the possible repercussions of the committee's advice and decisions. Again, could you perhaps elaborate upon what you meant by that?
I think what I meant was that he was alive to issues that could be of interest to ministers because of the possible political dimension to him.
We can take that down, thank you. In terms then of preparation of the minutes of the meetings of the ACVSB, was that your role?
I would do a first draft and get input from Dr. Raymond and then subsequently from Dr. Metters.
And then you would, I think, have meetings with Dr. Metters, you, Dr. Raymond and Dr. Metters, quite often before the committee meetings. What was the nature and purpose of those meetings?
Very often papers were running late, so we had to brief them on any late arriving papers, updating on who was coming, if it made any difference to who might introduce a paper, and if there were any questions that he wanted to ask based on the either the papers or the brief that we had prepared for him.
Now, we see mention in a number of the minutes and indeed in other documents of the importance of confidentiality of the committee's proceedings. Did you have any understanding at the time of why it was regarded as very important for the committee's meetings and recommendations and advice to be kept confidential?
Well, I think in the sense that given that they were advising on policy issues, normal expectation is that while policies in formulation, it wouldn't be shared very widely.
So it was from your understanding, it was the fact that this could form the basis of advice to ministers. Is that right?
Yes. That's right. Yes.
Can we then just pick matters up in terms of decision making on screening for non-A, non-B hepatitis, hepatitis C, with the chairman's brief for the second meeting. So DHSC 0003583_043. So we can see at the top of the page it's described as Chairman's Brief, Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, meeting 22nd of May 1989, which we know to be the second meeting. Again, I don't propose to go through the other issues that were being raised, but if we go to the bottom of the second page, please, Lawrence. So you'll see at the very bottom of the page, Mr. Canavan, the heading non-A, non-B, and then there's a reference to various papers that have been prepared for the meeting. And then paragraph 14 says, Professor Zuckerman, Dr. Raymond, Dr. Lane and Dr. Mortimer should be asked to speak to their respective papers. Dr. Gunson should then be asked to provide an update in relation to surrogate testing. Following the general discussions, you will wish to focus the committee's attention on the recommendations in paragraph 5 of ACVSB 27, which is one of the papers. I think that's Dr. Raymond's paper. You may wish to point out that while CBLA has legitimate concerns about marketing its products, the committee should consider the issues only in relation to protecting public health. The question is whether the committee agrees there is no pressing need to introduce routine surrogate testing for non-A, non-B hepatitis for health reasons, but that the position should be reconsidered when the results of the BTS study are available. Now, just two questions arising out of what's said there, Mr. Canavan. The first is this reference to the committee should consider the issues only in relation to protecting public health. Can you help us in understanding what was meant by that?
As best I recall, CBLA, which of course produced the blood products, might have had a concern that its products would have to be screened in the way that made them marketable elsewhere in competition with commercial product. So I think that point was being made, that was a non-issue as far as this committee was concerned. It should only be in relation to protecting public health.
And then the second question arises out of the following sentence. The question is whether the committee agrees there is no pressing need to introduce routine surrogate testing for non-A, non-B hepatitis for health reasons, but that the position should be reconsidered when the results of the BTS study are available. Now, it might be said that was the Secretariat giving a steer to Dr. Metters, or Dr. Harris, I think at this stage still, sorry, to give a steer to the committee as to how they should approach this, an invitation for them to agree that there was no pressing need to introduce routine surrogate testing. Would that be a fair way of reading this document, in your view?
No. I mean, I doubt if the Secretariat could have swayed a chairman, Dr. Harris or Dr. Metters, to that extent. But from what I've seen of the documents, I think the wording was picking up very much what was in the paper that had been presented to the committee.
And I won't go through the various papers, but for the benefit of those following, you address that in your witness statement at pages 28 to 29, and the paper on which is referenced there, ACVSB 2/7, Dr. Raymond's paper, it is, and we don't need to put this up on screen, Lawrence, but it's NHBT 5061_022. Can I then just move to the meeting on in May 1989, because I just want to understand how that then led to a collection of action points being put together. So if we look at the minutes from the 22nd of May 1989, first of all, NHBT 305019 no, I think that's it, sorry. I was about to give you an underscore when there isn't one. So this is meeting 22nd of May 1989. If we go to page 3, we can see there the section non-A, non-B, between paragraphs 15 and 16 is the heading. Thank you, Lawrence. And then we can see in paragraph 17, there's reference to the Chiron test and need for caution. There's been enormous progress. Once the sequence is published, it would be possible to test without recourse to Chiron. Paragraph 18 refers to the Council of Europe questionnaire and Dr. Gunson updating that. The next refers to the possibility of funding ALT testing by plasma fractionators. Paragraph 20, it was agreed non-A, non-B testing should not be introduced into the MBTS prior to the results of the UK BTS non-A, non-B trial. And then paragraph 20, the department would keep the issue of testing under review. So that's what the minutes say. And then I just wanted to ask you to look at a summary of action points and then just explore a couple of matters relating to that. So that's at DHSC 0002494_048. We can see this relates to the meeting of the 22nd of May, summary of action points arising. Was it your routine practice to produce a document of this kind after each meeting, or is your recollection that this was a one-off?
I don't recall that I routinely produced a summary of action. I would normally rely on the minutes reflecting whatever action was required.
And then if we just go to the second page, we can see there that there are a number of points set out. Paragraph 8 concerns the policy of accepting donors, and then we have various other matters set out. Paragraph 11 refers again to the questionnaire, which we saw reflected in the minutes. And then it's 12 to 14 I wanted to ask you about, Mr. Canavan. So paragraph 12 says, consider prospective study of post-transfusion non-A, non-B, either among blood recipients or in stored sera of the haemophiliacs. Consider contacting MRC. Now, that's identifying actions for the future, including the possibility of contacting the MRC. Whose role would it have been to put those into effect?
I couldn't say for certain who would have been picking that up to do it. I wouldn't have, given the nature of the items, I wouldn't have thought that I would have picked them up. I think it may have been the professional side of the department that would have picked it up.
And then can you assist us with the next paragraph that says, consider separate requirements for ALT testing? pure science or public health, question mark. Now, we saw the reference in the earlier document to the committee's need to focus on public health, but this is an action point arising from the meeting on the 22nd of May. Are you able to assist us in understanding what that question, pure science or public health, was trying to...
I'm sorry, I really couldn't interpret it, this remove, no.
Understood. 14 says, consider reminding clinicians of need for post-transfusion hepatitis reporting. Now, again, this doesn't tell us whose responsibility that would have been. Would that be something that you would expect to be being picked up by the CMO's office, if it's advice to clinicians?
Yes.
And then the last one, point 15, keep subject under close review. I think the minutes themselves had said keep the issue of testing under review rather than close review. But in any event, what was your understanding at this point of time of the degree of urgency with which this issue was being considered by the committee and the department?
I cannot recall what my thinking was, but looking back, it was a subject that came up at all the meetings I attended. So it merited its place on the agenda of every meeting.
I wonder if we can just go back for a moment to the minutes where the question of non-A and non-B testing arises.
So that's NHBT 0005019, and it's page 3, Lawrence. Paragraphs 16 to 21.
It's the paragraph 21. The first sentence is one which you've already picked up and asked Mr. Canavan about. There is, however, the last sentence. This may reflect, you may want to reflect, Mr. Canavan, on the degree of urgency in this, given that the members appear to have regarded the matter of keeping testing under review to be a priority. It looks as though there is a degree of urgency, at least, in that, at least might be said.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, I think that was in relation to testing generally, rather than to MRC particularly.
And is that reflected in the action points, would you say?
If we want those back on...
Urgency?
If we could see the action points again.
Absolutely. So if we can have back on screen, DHSC 0002494_048, page 2, please, Lawrence.
I mean, I cannot now remember what lay behind the comments in the action points, but reading them now, I think they all refer to this wasn't a closed subject and there had to be ongoing consideration of various aspects.
Thank you.
Sorry, I note the time, although we started a little late, I think probably the right moment for our morning break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until 5 to 12. 5 to 12.